In looking at my own diagnosis, the first thing to understand is the correlation between the individual, the family, the cult, and the species. So the individual is a fractal representation of the family and its system. The family is a fractal representation of the cult or culture and its system, which is a fractal representation of the species as a whole. Now, as you can see, there's a corollary shape, meaning the general relay of energy is such that the child responds to the family responds to the bigger environment, but we have both a cultural influence and an ecological influence. For example, a culture with a 4-season cycle that has freezing winter and hot summer will tend to breed a more time-oriented and a more future-oriented people than a culture in a more even climate, right? So cultures around the equator, for example, are much more temperate. There's much less volatility in temperature. And this is due to the relevance in different environments to the strategy of meeting the human need, first and foremost of survival. So you can imagine a person in July living in upstate New York, where I grew up, getting up off the beach at the lake and cutting wood so that it had time to cure and dry for the winter, so that in a 3-foot blizzard, there would be enough wood to keep warm. In other words, when you have lots of volatility in any arena, and you experience the volatility in an arena that relates to survival, for example, regular bankruptcies where the bank loses all their money, right? That type of action stimulates more planning for the future, more diversification to manage the volatility that threatens survival. And so someone in an equatorial climate where it's always warm, on an island where there's always fish and tropical fruits year-round, does not need to get off the beach in July to plan for January. And so they don't. They don't need an awareness of time in order to survive. And naturally, being spontaneous and in the moment is easier than thinking about the future. So it is volatility, trauma, and pain that take someone out of the present moment and inspire thought about the future. So this is an example of the ecological impact of the fractal pattern of identity, cult identity, family identity, individual identity, corporate identity. So an identity is the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And every child, to the best of their ability, develops a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that, to the best of their knowledge, accelerates their odds of surviving, feeling secure in that survival, experiencing some sense of love and belonging and validation in the cultural system that they're in. Now, one of the things that can happen is in insane cults or cultures, meaning cults that are oriented self-referentially in the past, there can be one direction for well-being that is rewarded within the cult, and another direction of well-being that is rewarded in the current ecological environment. Now, sometimes also you might have a situation where, for example, someone who is a radical, I think, Hasidic Jew or something, wearing a certain hat and having long hair, etc., results in them being blessed at home, but teased and humiliated everywhere else. And then neither has anything to do with the environment, right? Meaning someone that's wearing a certain motif, if it's a headdress or something, they're wearing that in a desert where it's hot, or, in which case it's a liability to the body, or they're wearing it in the snow, in which case it's an asset. It's another form of body covering that many people don't have, that's covering the whole face. And so you have a dissociation between the protocol and the underlying natural environment. So when you look at a system, it has a cycle. And healthy systems are very circular and symmetrical in that cycle. Unhealthy systems are, very lopsided. They're very asymmetrical. But in healthier systems, they're somewhat circular, and there is a cycle. And the sweet spot, the point of ease, tends to be in the middle, right? Because you can be lopsided. You could move the attachment for a bicycle wheel, for example, to one side. You could attach the bicycle wheel to the bike there. And in certain stages of the cycle, this would make for a very easy ride. You wouldn't have to do anything, just the weight of the bike would pull the wheel forward. But then at the very next moment, once this had come all the way down to the bottom, then you have to push hard and lift the entire weight of the bicycle in order to go forward. And so what's easy at one point in the cycle is hard in the other point of the cycle. It's the center that has the state of grace. It's the center that can carry the weight of what is put on a bicycle or a car or a train, and allows the least amount of friction going forward. Now, that point of grace, that point of ease, is, the ideal. And it's never perfectly achieved, but it is the figurative ideal, the perfect center. And as you move to the left or to the right of that perfect center, you become off balance, out of center, and with that you become more volatile. You can think as you push the pendulum more to the right, eventually you're going to get tired of holding it, you're going to let go, and it's going to swing more to the left. And as you lean more to the right in a given system, eventually that's going to go down and you're going to find yourself on the left. And you can see that with a wheel, that how it naturally moves in that direction. All life is moving forward in a somewhat circular direction. And so leaning far to the right, if you follow life's course as the wheel turns, you will find that you are eventually far to the left. This is very common, even in politics. If you keep pushing into the extreme right, you will eventually find the flaw, the dis-ease, and often the first reaction is to flip to the opposite, in the same way that a child that sympathetically copies and adopts everything that is given to them by their cult. As they move into adolescence, that extreme is reversed as the adolescent rejects and rebels against each point. So this is partly context to understand that a diagnosis is the location of an identity, a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that the ego identifies with, says that's I. This I am this pattern. It is a pattern that is off-center, and you find it through the diagonal, right? If you want to find something in space, you've got, the vastness of undifferentiated space, and you send one line across and you say, okay, I think it's right here. You send the other line across and you think it's right here, and you've got a diagnosis by two diagonal lines that intersect in the circle to locate where a pattern is. And in this case, you're locating a dis-ease, an asymmetry. So you locate it, and then the question is how to remedy it. But a more important question is, if there's a dis-ease in an individual, if there's an asymmetry in an individual, there is an asymmetry in the family. And if there's an asymmetry in the family, there's an asymmetry in the cult. And if there's an asymmetry in the cult, there may or may not be asymmetries in both the natural ecology or in the species as a whole. Now, asymmetries occur if you understand that all of reality is a system of nested cycles. And they're not all fitting perfectly symmetrically in one place. You might have a 1 million year cycle, and then you might intersect that with a 100,000 year cycle over here. And then within that, you might have a 100-year cycle, and then a 200-year cycle, and then you have fractal, representations of those cycles at different scales. But you can very much look at the universe as a physical dimensional expression of this invisible and visible pattern of energy, where you have suns, and then you have certain planets going around suns, you have certain moons going around certain planets, you have certain solar systems going around certain galaxies, you have certain galaxies moving around in the universe as a whole, and so there's all of these different patterns, and each pattern has a different age group. Some cycles take 90,000 years for a certain orbit to take place. Other patterns take 10,000, 20,000, etc. And it seems big if you're a 100-year pattern. So human life is roughly a 100-year cycle. If you're a 100-year pattern, then a 10,000-year pattern starts to feel unrelatable. A 300-year pattern, a little bit more relatable, but that's in the future. And 300 years in the past, many people aren't that interested in anything that didn't happen in the last year. And so there's, what we relate to in all these different patterns, it tends to be self-referential in terms of, is it relevant within the within that 100-year lifespan. And there's plenty of things that are relevant in the 100-year lifespan that, we don't pay attention until they, present themselves. But if we understand that we're part of a number of intersecting cycles in different ways, and that's really what life is. There's actually, we think of physical reality. In fact, what we think of as physical reality are rapidly moving relationships of energy with just this tiny little thing called, a proton or an electron, etc., but 99% is actually space. And it just feels solid because we're moving our hand at this speed and it's going around at this speed. So you can kind of get a sense that even though this point of this pen is very, very small, if the pen is going around, 1,000 RPMs or 10,000 RPMs, and I try to push in it, I start to feel it solid here. If before I can push further in, it's done another revolution, then this tiny little point is pushing my whole hand back. It feels solid when there's actually mostly space there, but I'm just pushing into that space a little bit. So this is context for my diagnosis, which is my family's diagnosis, which is my culture's diagnosis. And again, all diagnoses are an identification of a region of asymmetry that is so lopsided, that's so extreme or unbalanced that it's creating suffering for the participants in that particular cycle. And well-being is the remedy, is being able to, once you diagnose the imbalance, finding something that moves you closer to center, closer to balance. So the first kind of major dis-ease comes in the form of trauma. So as a very small person in relationship to very big people, in a dependent relationship, trauma is very easy because if the giants reveal rage, hurt, distaste, hate, those can kill me as an infant. And so, in the midst of parental fighting, in the midst of narcissistic self-absorption, in the midst of tiredness of having to take care of a baby, in the lack of regulation. So, for example, the disease in our cult is that no parent receives a single hour of formal parental training. You're an American cult, you're off in the wilderness somewhere, you decide to have sex, you have a baby. You don't have to go to a hospital, you don't have to become educated, you don't have to learn anything about trauma or caring for that child. You may have hereditarily picked up and copied your family system, but if that's not a very good system, then you're not a very good parent, right? If your parent enjoyed tormenting you and saying that that's love, you may be a very confused parent. And so, that's the first thing. A child comes into a largely parentally illiterate home. The parent has gone to high school and learned algebra. They didn't learn about the importance of breastfeeding. They didn't learn about attachment theory. They didn't learn about trauma or PTSD or how to repair it. None of the important things got covered. And so we see the blind spot. We see it as a species, we see it as a cult, we see it as a family, and then we see it as a child. And so I would say the first major dis-ease is shock, confusion, overwhelm, helplessness, confusion, fear, terror, loneliness. So this is the first dis-ease, and the healthy response to that is empathy. Now, the next disease comes in the lack of empathy and the lack of repair. And so here again, we come into the idea, which is a blind spot, which is that our cult, for some time in the West has believed that basically that the traumas and terrors of childhood are dissociated from so effectively that they don't have any impact in adulthood. And so you basically kind of do what's necessary to get your kids through. And if they're screaming and you can't manage it, send them to their room and that type of thing. But it's no big deal, and it's normal to basically terrorize your children and leave them to deal with it. And you shouldn't let them get the upper hand or bow to their concerns, because then they'll become weak, and so they should be toughened up, etc. And so that's the mindset. But what that did in my case is, and it's a fairly normal experience, was it destroyed trust. Because untrained, unregulated giants terrorized me, hit me, shouted around me, glared at me, ordered me to do things I couldn't do, frightened me in various ways, number one. And then number two, humiliated and dissociated, and in some senses added psychological torment, by either enjoying at times that hurt and pain, or by dissociating from it. Go to your room, and when you're willing to hide and suppress the feelings we've induced in you, then you can come back. In other words, you're going to be left alone as long as you express the feelings that any healthy person would feel when treated abusively by a sociopathic, incompetent giant. So that protocol then leads to numbness and dissociation, because it's so unbearable to be in a dependent relationship and all alone and afraid, and then have that escalated into psychological and emotional abuse for communicating that terror, that there's a desperate need to find something and someone that is safe as an antidote to all that terror. Now, unfortunately, my parents, Michael and Sherilyn, decided that the general culture wasn't very healthy. And so they were going to kind of raise their kids off in the woods, away from the toxic input, toxic input of the general culture. But what that meant, when neither of them knew what they were doing, was there was no safe, sane person to turn to. Now, there may or may not have been any safe, sane person to turn to in the world, in general. That would have depended on the context. But the message of isolation miles away from anyone was that you are completely dependent on these people who enjoy hurting you and who can kill you if they want to at any time. Now, this makes justice really important, or it makes, it's a very desperate situation for a small child. And so the question is there a way to win? Is there a way to play things, to show up where I will not be hurt, where I will be welcomed, where I will have honor, safety, security, a sense of belonging. And this is where rules, routine, typically can come in. We do this, but we don't do this. And if you play by these rules, then you are welcome. So looking for those rules was an almost desperate need. The problem was that my parents were hypocrites, meaning I was looking for the rules and they would spell them out, but the rules would change. That's the one problem. So how do I win if they're changing? And they're not, and then I'm not given notice of the change. So this is how you create learned helplessness. If you create too much randomness and start shocking a dog, for example, and there's no way to get out, they just lay there and get shocked. It's called learned helplessness. And so the rules would change. There wasn't a heads up on the rules changing. And then the final thing was my parents were hypocrites, meaning when they wanted to break the rule, then they did. And when they break the rule and you caught them breaking the rule, then there was another rule, which is you get to break the rule when you catch me breaking the rule. So if mom said we don't have dessert until after dinner, but then you caught mom, if you went and got some dessert before dinner, you would be hit and told that you're a bad person for sneaking and breaking the rule and blah, 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 blah. This is a big deal. But if you waited, you could catch mom breaking the rule. And then if you caught mom breaking the rule, then you were in on the crime. Now, this is our secret. Don't tell the other kids. You can have some. I'll continue to sneak. And now you're not a bad person, right? And so, these 3 or 4 levels of confusion about how to avoid the trauma and how to avoid being shamed for the symptoms of trauma were how to figure out all of these rules. Now, these were crazy enough, and there was enough lying and betrayal going on that it pretty much meant that around this stage, I dissociated from my parents, trusting them as, what they said, basically. And instead, I began looking at them as a pattern. So basically, mom and dad are like this, and then every so often, there would be a this, and then it will be like this. But if one of them is going like this, then the other one will go like this, and this, and this. And the next level of confusion, in this kind of rule breaking and stuff, was that if I tried to point out the hypocrisy, the violation of the law, so to speak, that we had been shamed into, this is so important. If I pointed out the hypocrisy, then I would be punished. So there was no way to have a verbal shared reality. Because it's a shared reality to say, look, mom, first of all, the rules do not always make sense. Secondly, they change, and you don't communicate that. Thirdly, you punish us and shame us. Fourthly, you break the laws yourself, and you don't punish and shame yourself. And finally, if I break them with you, when you break them, I'm rewarded. But if I point out that you're breaking them, I am punished. So you see a complete reversal, because if you're breaking them and I catch you, then the exact same behavior leads to a reward doing the opposite. So don't eat pie before dinner. That's the supposed law. And then you're eating pie. So now if I eat pie, I'm benefited. If I tell you not to eat pie, I'm punished. So that pattern is very difficult for a young person to figure out, first of all. So talking about it and trying to get sanity, but you're doing this, is an important part of establishing the basis of a rapport with a child. But that's not possible if you are traumatized and punished, and the trauma is just coming from you're very small, and you're aware that you're all alone in a dependent relationship from these big people that feel rage, that feel narcissism, that feel hatred, that will do whatever is right for them at your expense, which always has the looming awareness they could kill me. They can do whatever they want. And I can't protest because the protest results in even more punishment and there's no one to back me up. Now, this surfaces much later in life, meaning what happens then is an inward collapse of the inner warrior archetype. Because if you can imagine, the warrior archetype with the sword, when it's a fair fight between a 6-year-old and a 6-year-old, when it's a fair fight between a 30-year-old and a 30-year-old, when you have similar weaponry and preparation and understanding, then the warrior results in protection of a boundary. Even a sociopath will not cross a boundary when they are afraid of their own suffering increasing. That's the only thing that a sociopath respects. A sociopath respects their own suffering. And so if you tell a sociopath, please don't do this, you're hurting me, the sociopath will say, oh, well, you're in the way, whatever, I've got to, and they'll carry on doing the thing that hurts you. But if you hurt the sociopath while they're hurting you, they may stop the behavior, not because they care about you, that would be empathic, but rather they don't want the discomfort. And so the only way to protect a boundary with a sociopath is to cause them harm. However, when you have a big discrepancy in scale, a giant and a small one in a sociopathic relationship, well then, the warrior comes forth and says, stop, this isn't right, this isn't fair, this is the line here. And the sociopath just escalates the torment, just sends more violation, more hostility. And in the law of mass, the larger object always wins, particularly in a dependent relationship. In the law of mass, the bigger object always wins, In a dependent relationship where the male is the breadwinner and the male has the rank and the male has the social skills, the contacts, the situation, and the male has the money and the male has the larger body. If the male raises a voice and says, shut up, we're doing it this way, and then the person says, no, I don't want to be dominated, well, then get out on the street, right? It's a dependent relationship. It's one of the reasons it's very healthy not to enter a relationship where someone is chronically dependent on you and doesn't want to develop the skills and abilities to be independent, or in which you are chronically dependent on a much bigger party. Because there's no disincentive for a sociopath, for someone in a sociopathic state, to treat you well if you need them and they don't need you, if you have no other options and they do. And there are always going to be times in a relationship where there's friction, where I want this and you need that. And if it starts to feel like a sacrifice, then the sociopathic tendencies tend to increase in the relationship, and it becomes an increasingly unbalanced and unhealthy relationship. Versus if you respond to that dynamic by growing skills, by finding people in more equal rank, someone closer to your own size psychologically, financially, etc., then there's less of that bullying dynamic, simply because it doesn't work. It's not that there isn't an impulse. When people are frightened, tired, and in pain, their impulse is to do whatever will relieve that. if whatever will relieve that most expediently is abusing and taking advantage of mass to get what they want, then there's a tendency to do that. And so part of the issue of isolation was there's also no social peer pressure to stop my parents from abusing their children in the way that there might have been if we lived in a village, for example, where a screaming child, etc., is going to be heard by 100 people. It's not that the parents are less sociopathic in that context. It's just they're worried about them being looked at as bad is higher when they're in a group and they don't want to look bad versus when they're alone. And so a lot of the codependent hatred between parent and child comes, that the child will act up and manipulate the parent when they're in public. And then when the parent can get the child into an isolated state, they'll beat the shit out of them for making them look bad in public. And now they don't look bad because nobody is there to witness the retaliation. The trouble is, one's a giant that's 10 times bigger than the other, and it's in a dependent relationship. So that tends to, escalate trauma. So, what I basically learned was that, the only way to kind of navigate was out of a constant fear and anxiety to try and figure out what would make the peace and please people, and that I had to fit that shape, whatever that shape was, that would make things easier for the people that would hit me whenever it got hard. And that became that kind of pleaser situation became a lifesaver, meaning I've got to please and understand and connect or I'm dead. Now, at the same time, the belief is that if I fight for what's right, I'm going to be dead. If I stand up and say, hey, this isn't right, then I'm going to be dead. And that is, that remains in my body today, the belief and the physiological experience that I'm going to die if I stand up for myself with an aggressive abuser of any kind. And this is this has horrifying implications, because that physiological sense that I'm going to die by doing this discourages me from standing up for boundaries, which in turn trains other people to cross the boundaries, which brings up that fear again. And so there's this tremendous panic that I live with all the time of not existing. Like, I don't exist because I have no right to set a boundary with a warrior. I can only, work within the kind of the realm of the pleaser and kind of negotiator. And if I don't figure all that out, then I'm going to be dead, basically. Now, all of this fear and trauma also led to a deep desire to understand and to attach, to have a secure emotional relationship with anyone. And I tried with both parents. And both of my parents are afraid of intimacy, were afraid of intimacy. And so the more I would try to get close, the more frightened they would be of intimacy and proximity, and the more they would react with fear and anger and hate to push me away as I tried to get close and establish a secure, safe connection that would allow my adrenals to calm down, my cortisol levels to go down, etc., so I wouldn't be constantly anxious. So that as well doubled back on itself. In other words, The response to all this fear and anxiety and stress is to try and find a safe place to reset and calm down. That's seeking a secure attachment with one or both parents. But both of them responded with antipathy, knocking me back in the other direction, meaning their dissociation from me would go up to counteract my efforts to form a secure and safe relationship, which led to a catch-22 absolute panic. I desperately need to calm down and relax. What every child needs is a safe giant to nestle to calm down with. I didn't have a safe giant. Both my parents were afraid of their emotions, and they'd isolated us within the general cult. So there was no place. So as I would get panicky and try to move closer, they would get panicky about the closeness and hit me away. And because they were bigger, and the fear of being hit away became bigger than the need to be close, it just created this vibration of constant anxiety and panic and fear, and there's no fucking outlet. Now, in an emotionally and psychologically intelligent cult, anyone would look at these anxious children, etc., and say, "Oh, you must be, being bandied around by sociopathic parents in traumatized states who don't know what they're doing. There's nothing wrong with you. Let's love and form a secure bond with this infant and finally give you a place to calm down and be safe." But instead, in a psychologically illiterate cult, because my parents weren't raised in a vacuum, right? The same cult that trained my parents and raised my parents was also the cult of my parents' peers. So my anxiety, my stuff was labeled. And this is what ignorance looks like. So, for example, if you take a baseball bat and you beat the shit out of an infant, their bones will break and their head will crack open and there will be blood all over the room. Now, a sane person walking into the room with that happening does not say, "What's wrong with this child?" and ignore the parent that is beating them. A sane person says, "What's wrong with these parents? Let's get this kid to a hospital. There's nothing wrong with this 2-year-old. We've got to stop the beating, and it is the responsibility of the giants, those of them who are sane, to protect the innocent, the vulnerable, and the young." In a sociopathic cult, it's whatever goes on in the house and behind closed doors is none of anyone else's business. If I want to fuck up my kids, I have the right. And in particularly sociopathic families, if you try to rescue an abused member of that family, and the abuser finds out that someone is trying to help one of their victims escape, the response is an escalating abuse with the intended effects to say, if you try and help my child, I'm going to kill him. And it's going to be your fault because you tried to help them. And this is the exact same thing in abusive spousal relationships. If I hear that you're talking to someone about protecting you from my violence, I'm going to kill you. So that's kind of another expression of that warrior killing protocol. that shut me down, that left me defenseless. Because I had a defense, I expressed the defense, and every single time I did, the violence of a traumatic nature increased to the point where I knew I could die, and I knew I couldn't win. And so it was sane, it was rational to go limp and cut off aggression, since that let my father and mother know that they had won the fight, which calmed them down so that they didn't have to fight a 5-year-old to get any basic sense of value. And no one else even asked, right? The message of the cult is very, very, very clear. We don't want to know, we don't know, and we're not going to intervene. So I developed hyperactive anxiety to be ready for all this stuff going on. And my parents promptly labeled me as hyperactive, as a pathology. The hyperactivity was not a pathology. It was the most successful way I could come to distract myself from the dread and paralysis of waiting to be hit, something I couldn't control. And the push-pull between wanting to defend what was right and just and realizing that I will be hit if I do, and that I can't win because I'm with children, right? Because it takes a certain amount of maturity for a parent to say, you're right. I am stealing, I am cheating, I am lying. And you're right, this isn't the rule. And you're right that I'm breaking this because I can, even though, the rule has some good basis for it. And you're right that I'm a hypocrite. And I understand that that makes you feel lonely. You see, why do you feel lonely? Why do I feel lonely? When my parents live in the club where they do whatever they want, and I live in the club where I'm repeatedly shamed and blamed for doing what I want. I feel lonely, first of all, because there's a wall. We're over here, and you're over here. We're not on the same team. We're not playing by the same rules. We don't have the same standards. And the other part of that wall is the wall is for our benefit at your expense. Meaning there's not a double standard that we take better care of you than we take care of ourselves. The double standard communicates that we value ourselves more than we value you. And this is a humiliating thing to experience in a dependent relationship. I desperately need you, we know, and that's neither here nor there. We have the power to be here in this set of rules. And we have the power to put you there in that set of rules, and we're not applying our rules to you. You are separate from us. Our feelings matter is another way of saying it. Our feelings matter. Yours don't. When you desperately want to do this and we've said you can't do it, tough. When we desperately want to do this and we've said it's not to be done, well, our feelings matter, but your feelings don't. So it's a narcissistic message. It's an egocentric message. But what it is communicating in a terrifying pattern to an infant, to a child, is that we're always going to put ourselves first. And there's nothing you can do about it. And while we are going to increase your terror and your desperation and your need, We're not going to let you into the club where those needs come at a same level of priority as our own. You are excluded. You're on the other side of the line. So there's loneliness there. The hyperactivity helped protect against the hurt and humiliation of that loneliness. Because one of the deepest laws in the family system, one of the deepest laws in the American cult, is thou shalt not feel. Thou shalt not feel intensely. Thou shalt not feel hurt. Thou shalt not feel lonely. If you watch hurt, lonely American children, you will find them lying to say what the cult rewards, but what is the opposite of what they're feeling. And this is to escape the trap that the cult has set up. Meaning, treating one person in a dependent relationship as a second-class citizen in the group hurts. It hurts a lot because it's a message of exclusion, which is, in a dependent relationship, a message of helplessness and of humiliation. I need you. I depend on you. I know. And you're going to have to do it my way and live in a different world as a second-class citizen. But I need you. I know. And that's why you're going to be put in a second-class room. And you're going to do it because I said so and because I can. That hurts a lot. But the American cult doesn't like to confront its cruelty. Don't talk back to your parents. These kids are getting uppity. What a sissy. There's a tremendous barrage of armaments prepared within the cult norms to shame vulnerable feelings. And one of the more vulnerable feelings in hurt is, you hurt me. And so you find teenagers and children in America saying, you can't hurt me. I don't need you. I don't need anyone. No one's going to tell me what to do. I'm independent. You find a cult creating more and more loneliness because when people express their hurt, it is humiliated. It is shamed. It is turned away from, which creates more loneliness. Because if I'm hurt and you say, tell me about it, and I'm sorry for hurting you, that restores and includes. If I say I'm hurt and you turn away, that's escalating the loneliness. That's escalating the shame. The boundary is being reinforced. I'm saying I'm in desperate hurt, and you're saying you're over here, and I'm over here. It's not my problem. That is the tenet of the sociopathic brain. It's not my problem, because I've erected a barrier between you and us. And now there's your problems and there's my problems. And it's fine that you're hurt. And I'm not going to do anything about it, because that's your hurt and you're separate from me, says the reptilian brain. It's our hurt, and we're going to solve this together, says the empathic brain. When hurt is met with reptilian behavior, it calcifies. It doesn't digest and move, because an infant, a child, depends on the cult and family system to digest their feelings. They're too big to deal, particularly when the feelings the child's are digesting are not actually their feelings, they're the cult's feelings. They're the parents' feelings. They're grandmother's feelings that got beaten into dad, who never had a chance to deal with them, and now he's giving them to you. And you're 5 years old. You can't digest three people's feelings. In a sociopathic and culturally or emotionally illiterate cult, you could maybe digest your own feelings if you had a model of how to do that. But every time you try and bring your feelings to the table, there's an outburst from mom and dad that there's not space for you to exist, that your existence is terrifying them, that your existence is bad, that your feelings are bad. Now, I learned in the midst of this that I am unlovable, that I was unlovable, and that there's something innately bad in my feelings and in my expressing my feelings and in my representing my needs, my boundaries, and holding them. I learned that I will be rejected, I will be shamed, I will be hit, and I will be criticized and punished for ruining the family if I speak these feelings, if I speak these sensations in my body, if I ask for what I want, if I point out the injustices. So the hyperactivity helps distract me from that, but now that becomes pathologized. Now, the hyperactivity also makes concentrated learning more difficult for me. So now I have a learning disorder, meaning my parents, in a psychologically illiterate culture, all of the faults of the ecology are transferred onto the scapegoat. For example, in an agriculturally illiterate cult, the agriculturally illiterate, quote, gardener transfers the rose into the shade, deprives it of water, deprives it of organic matter, and then the rose develops drooping leaves. And in such a cult, the gardener chastises the rose for developing drooping leaf syndrome. And then the bud doesn't form. And the agriculturally illiterate gardener says that you have a birth defect, you can't give birth. And the stalks become drier. And the gardener complains, why aren't you growing? Right? Because it's the same dynamic. Every rose, given light, organic matter, water, buried at the right height where their their stems don't rot, their roots are covered in soil. Every rose grows. Put in the dark without organic matter and more without water, every rose dies. Now, a fool blames the rose. In a materialist cult, such as our own, we understand how dumb a gardener would have to be to blame the rose. In a traumatically illiterate, emotionally illiterate, parentally illiterate, psychologically illiterate, biologically illiterate cult that doesn't understand the causes of traumas or the various symptoms, that doesn't understand the attachment symptoms, then each depravity of the parent in the cult is transferred and pathologized as a label on the child. So I began to get labels. Learning disability. Dane has a learning disability. We don't have a traumatic disability, i.e. we traumatize our children and we don't repair it. And we don't educate them on how to repair it either. We shame them for expressing feelings. So the symptoms begin to rise. Hyperactivity, learning disability, bedwetting. This is a process where, because you can't deal with intense terror during the day, the body tries to release the intense terror with nightmares. And in that pattern of tension and panic and release, bedwetting is actually a way that the body can let go of all that anxiety fully in the body. But we've decided to humiliate that protocol. Again, shaming the victim of that ignorance rather than questioning, gee, so you've managed to raise a child that is terrified, that can't process their feelings during the day, that can't calm down, and as a result of not calming down, they can't learn to read, and none of you are talking about any of this with the kid. Seems pretty dumb, right? Why don't we give some of this back and you start doing your work, parents in community and school? Now, this is escalated as I go to kindergarten with my, quote, godmother. Well, first of all, having experienced that the two giants around me enjoy terrifying me and not being able to have a secure attachment, I have extreme anxiety about being deposited in a kindergarten. Having been shamed repeatedly, I feel unusual shame and terror of being the center of attention. But because my mother is disorganized and unregulated in most everything, she usually deposits me at kindergarten late. So she's late, and she has escalated terror of being seen by shaming what is seen at home. And she's now putting me at the center of attention because she's late, and she's abandoning me at the same time into the unknown. And a child projects the world to be like their parents. They just assume, rightly or wrongly, that the rest of the world is like their parents. But it's more terrifying to be punished in an unknown way by a new terror person than it is to be punished in a familiar way by your terrorists. And so as I go into kindergarten in terror and abandonment, I've also had my feelings humiliated repeatedly. Well, naturally, it's very hard to calm down in kindergarten. And so my kindergarten teacher threatens to send me into the cellar below the kindergarten to be eaten alive by witches that she has told the class exist. And she blames me for fidgeting. She doesn't blame herself for not knowing anything about trauma. She doesn't blame my parents for traumatizing me. She doesn't protect me as my, quote, godmother. She adds to the terror, the shame, and the humiliation as my godmother. In other words, those associated with God and mothering blame and terrorize the most frightened and traumatized people in their midst. This is cruel, this is ignorant, this is sociopathic, and it is normal in the American cult, at least in my generation. Whether it's getting better or worse, nobody's gathering data. You know, one of the biggest diseases in our cult is that I have never been asked once in 47 years to share what I'm sharing in this video. Now, in an intelligent cult, you are asked to share the data that is most relevant to your own and other people's well-being. Okay? Severe childhood neglect and trauma is the most relevant thing to my well-being, and by extension, the people around me. When I'm terrified on a daily basis about small things and feel like I'm 3 years old, everyone around me has the experience of walking on eggshells or not understanding why what they're doing is such a big deal. I know why it's a big deal, but nobody knows. Nobody asks. Nobody knows. Nobody knows what it would have been like to interact with me before PTSD. Nobody asks how it feels to know that I've been given a disease that has been buried by dump loads of dirt in a cult that will shame me for talking about it and will bury the crime and then tell me to live in the present and get on with it, right? Do you know how lonely that is? How ignorant? How cruel? You see, you don't. I'm in a cult that doesn't know. And doesn't know because it doesn't know, and that's why we don't know, and that's why we're not going to talk about this anymore and go out and be busy. There is a profound commitment in our cult to silence around this. It's not easy to talk about this, by the way. I have to feel the terror that I'm going to die because I'm breaking the family rule, which is we don't tell the truth about these feelings or we'll kill you. We'll humiliate you. We'll torment you. We'll make you feel like you're worthless. I'm breaking that law. And the cult around me is, why do we have to listen to this? Right? We're talking trillions of dollars of cost, of lost vitality, beauty, truth, goodness in the economy, in the cult. Because this has nothing to do with me. I'm just a fractal pattern articulating one of many hereditary patterns shared with a percentage of this population. So my godmother would send me down in the cellar. Now, a traumatically literate person, a psychologically literate person would say, so the two giants at home terrorize you to such a point that the best coping mechanism is to be so busy doing something, maybe you'll be distracted and won't fear the next violation. You go to your godmother, who supposedly looks out for you, and who's your kindergarten teacher, and they blame you for the one thing that's helping you manage the terror when they're doing nothing. God's doing nothing. They're doing nothing. Mom's doing nothing. Dad's doing nothing. And nobody else is doing nothing, is doing anything. Everyone else is colluding with the labels. You're right, Dane is hyperactive. They're not, wait a minute, that's an intelligent kid there. What's up with that? How did you breed hyperactivity in? What are you doing, parents? Kids don't evolve in a vacuum. You see, and that shame was too hard to deal with for my parents because their parents shamed them and didn't teach them any of this stuff either, right? Now, one of my symptoms is bitterness and cynicism. Now, this ties in with another kind of part of this pattern, which is that the abuse of my kindergarten teacher happened in the Hawthorne Valley Waldorf School. Mary Louise Bedard The kindergarten teacher there, my godmother, was my abuser. But when you blame the child for everything and feelings are punished, I may not even have told my parents that I would get locked up in the cellar in kindergarten in the dark. Now, the same traumatic illiteracy also shames and minimizes the brain continuum of sensitivity. So within the probability field of any cult or culture, 10 to 20% of the brains are significantly more responsive and sensitive to certain stimuli than others. This goes into kind of introverts who think more, etc., have more vivid imagination. Well, I'm in that category. Elaine Aron calls that the highly sensitive person category. So in the dark, in the cellar, these vivid witches conjured to torture and terrify a child become much more real. It's not like, I can't visualize it. No, I can visualize because I have my parents. I know when they want to hurt me. The idea that there are beings out there in the dark that want to kill me, well, I can visualize it very easily. And it absolutely terrifies me. But my godmother doesn't apologize for being a sociopathic bitch. She asks me to apologize for fidgeting. The idea being that if you're so terrified you need to fidget in order to run that energy, that if we terrify you some more for showing the symptoms of being terrified, that somehow we've come up with this great solution. It's sheer psychological ignorance and cruelty. And a 6-year-old is asked to live the consequences of that indefinitely. Because a coward that will do that will never own up. Mary Louise Bedard would never give me an apology. In fact, in my adolescent, when she kept doing some of her kind of weird stuff that I found, quite annoying as an adolescent, I wrote her a letter expressing, some mild anger. And that's the last I've ever heard, And see, part of the cynicism and bitterness here ties in, so apparently I'm disowned. I'm not good enough to be a godchild for actually mentioning the slightest fault. You see, and you wonder, where do these fragile Waldorf teachers come from? Where do these fragile parents come from? That one comment from a kid sets them off into sociopathic states where it's all about them and never about the child. So the bitterness and cynicism as I'm asked to live through this year after year after year, and as each thing gets transferred, as each fault within the parent is pathologized and labeled in me and not the parent, is the cover story, because the cover story is brilliant. My father has a nonprofit with philanthropist Manning Goodwin, right? The Cultural Freedom Foundation for cultural freedom across the world. Isn't it wonderful? It's hard to feel that wonder when you're terrified of being hit. When you're terrified of being shamed for the helplessness that comes up about being hit by a giant. When you're humiliated for those things, it's hard to feel how wonderful that is. So the Cultural Freedom Foundation, liberating the world, right? But I've still got the terror in my body. I'm not liberated. Then there's the passive solar home revolution, right? Back to nature, upstate New York, miles from anywhere, our own organic garden, a passive solar home. Wow, your parents are so advanced for their time. You see, a child in terror living in nightmares, developing more symptoms of PTSD and being shamed and punished for those symptoms, doesn't give a fuck whether they're living next to a nuclear power plant or whether they're living in the beatific hobbit hole that turns into a hell house at night. Doesn't give a fuck because it's meaningless. All that a child needs is a secure, healthy attachment with an empathic giant who would fight for their protection. That's what that child needs, is a stable set of guidelines to follow and be included and be welcome. I was terrified. And then there was the Waldorf School, right? You see, when you're sent down into a basement at a Waldorf school, it's so much more sophisticated because when you're nervously fidgeting, you're using natural beeswax crayons. This is wax created from bee and beehives. It's so much more natural. And the kindergarten in which the psychological torment is taking place every day is nice pastel shades of yellow and gold for these age groups, following Rudolf Steiner's mandate for the development of the soul. What a piece of crap. Seems like the only thing Steiner left out was what does a child do with a sociopathic parent and a sociopathic teacher? Can sit and read his lectures all day and beat their children. Can't come up with anything to help that? Then go fuck your goddamn colors. You know, it's just sickening what's used as a replacement. You know, it's like taking away your food and then giving you little stickers of be happy and be positive and be happy and be positive. Here, have another sticker. I need a meal. I'm starving. Be happy, be positive. Could we have a nice smile? Because within the passive solar home, and we were vegetarian, you know. We were so superior to all those people killing animals, and so superior to all those people living in the city, and so superior to all those people going to public schools, living in normal houses that weren't solar houses. We were lucky, wonderfully blessed children. You see, and you can give a child 10 million Be Happy stickers. If you won't give them a salad, a burrito, a piece of pizza, it doesn't mean anything. What you're really saying is we're so dumb, we don't even know what it is that you need. But who cares about that? We're not going to listen to you. We're not going to hear the meaning in those tears. We're just going to go on. We're going to pretend that everything's wonderful. And you're going to pretend too, or we're going to punish you. So bitterness, cynicism, disgust. You know, how many times does an adolescent have to watch their parents lie to each other and themselves and the children and realize, I keep my agreements, I don't lie. But that's too much to ask from the greatest parents that have ever existed, the pioneers in solar housing and all this. You know, it's such a dismal trade. All the right labels for all of the substance. One safe, sane, honorable, empathic giant. Because that's what every grown-up is to a child. One that will fight for the kid, that will put the kid first, is worth 1 million solar homes, is worth 1 billion directors of nonprofits to a child. And any intelligent psychologist, that is a question mark, an intelligent psychologist understands. You see, because my parents took me to a psychologist who never visited the house and who created this wonderful report after monitoring me for 20 or 30 hours on all of my patterns of behavior. Dane does this, he's like this, he's like this. There wasn't a single question that correlated that with anything going on in my school or in my family. And yet every single thing that I was doing and not doing had a correlation, an origin in the family and in the school. When my 3rd grade teacher died, in a family where all deep feelings were banned, I went numb. Nobody noticed that I lost the ability to grieve in that moment because I understood if I opened my feelings, I would be left alone in my room to cry myself into despair. And I didn't want that. I didn't want to be alone in another deep feeling. And so I shut down. I lost some of my humanity on that day. And I'd never seen a single grown-up grieve in their entire life. My parents certainly didn't know how to grieve. That was against the law of no feelings. I've never fully grieved anything in my entire life. Because the terror that my parents instilled in my body, you see, how does a child learn what's safe and what's not safe? There's no logic and reason in a 5-year-old. No, they watched the body language of the giants around them. And I watched my parents. And I have never seen them so terrified. So, we're going to collapse. I don't know what's going to happen. As when they were close to a deep feeling. And so my shutting down my deep feelings was to protect my parents from the greatest terror that I ever saw them in. I became frightening to them when they began to feel around them. And they would hit me for taking them too close to my and their fear. I've never learned how exactly the world ends when people share deep feelings and grieve. But my body tells me I'm going to die when I get close. And I'm still honoring those early habits today. And it's exhausting to keep all those feelings down. to keep all those feelings buried. It's exhausting. I feel so tired. My body feels so numb. And how do you change a habit of 40 years in a cult that pretends that it's all just par for the course? Let's not make too much of a fuss about it. You've lost parts of your humanity for decades. What else is new? Go make some money. Go do some shopping. Now, in the volatility of childhood and a deep and profound insecurity of connecting with other people, not being able to find a single solid person to regulate against. My third grade teacher at Hawthorne Valley Waldorf School was becoming such a person, a pretty solid emotional person who took a stand for the students. However, she was killed in a car accident in my third grade, and so no security there either. The replacement teacher leading to, well, the school was desperate to find a teacher in the sudden absence of a third grade teacher. Who they found was a very nervous, I would say, traumatized or, demonstrating a lot of, insecurity around authority, etc. And in the response that I had to the trauma of, that was the teacher I went numb with and kind of shut down around. I became more dissociative in terms of fidgeting more. And this teacher couldn't deal with any distraction. That was the first thing. And had no more traumatic literacy than any of the other grown-ups around me, or any ability to facilitate depth of emotion for the classroom. And so his response to feeling distracted and overwhelmed by my fidgeting was to give the school an ultimatum that he would resign or that I must be kicked out of school. And so the school promptly kicked me out. And so there's another insecurity. I had formed a strong relationship to a cat. Animals tend to be far safer and far more stable than traumatically illiterate human beings. And so I had formed an attachment to a cat. My father responded to me being kicked out of school by deciding to leave Hawthorne Valley and the Hawthorne Valley kind of community. The parents of my friends responded to me being kicked out by stopping their children playing with me so that I lost my school, my teacher, and my friends, for fear that I would be a bad influence on their children. And my father responded by saying, we're going to go to England. So then that's a big shift in the country, And, this whole thing is just happening faster than I know how to integrate it. And I didn't want to move. So my father took to manipulating cooperation and saying that, as I brought up various objections, I don't want to move, I don't want to leave my things, I don't want to leave my cat. My father responded to these specific defenses trying to manage change by saying he would bring my things and bring the cat to ensure cooperation. But then up at the point where we actually went and he had secured that cooperation, then at the last minute he brushed aside, well, of course we're not bringing your cat. And then when I arrived in England and wanted to know where my things were, that's when he said that, of course, he couldn't bring my things. And now I'm in a new country being teased for an accent, being teased for being an American, and trying to kind of orient in this new world. And my response to the untrustworthiness of people, the lack of stability, the lack of being able to form a single, strong, reliable emotional bond with a single person, was to, one, stay more infantile and stay emotionally regressed. So that's one response. The other was to get more interested in things. I also began to enact some of the abuse towards my younger siblings. So in a power dominance where abuse is not acknowledged and apologized for, etc., by the parent to the oldest son, it's very commonly passed down. Now, I went a certain degree on that direction of psychologically and physically abusing my younger siblings. And I didn't like who I became. And so I then started to withdraw, unable to kind of stop the intergenerational progression. I stopped, in terms of working within the mechanism. See, there's no support for a 12-year-old trying to find themselves in a family pattern. So instead, I just started to dissociate more. And then the other focus was on things. I became much more controlling about things and caring more about things, and much more particular about anyone moving my things. And I think this is a response to the fact that in order for someone to develop or take risks and grow, there has to be a stable base. Now, takes two forms. If you want to learn regulation of any kind, like think of a basketball. Imagine trying to play basketball if the hoop randomly moved around. You just can't. If you're just you aim and you're a bit to the left, and then you aim a bit to the right, and then the hoop moves to the left as you're trying to aim, it's pointless. This creates the phenomena of despair and learned helplessness. It doesn't matter what you do, the goal ends. And that's certainly something that both of my parents played. My mother more in terms of placing bribes in the future to secure cooperation and then just forgetting about them once the narcissistic expedient of her own need was met at that time by a future bribe. Now her need is met, and so of course, nobody else exists, and so we just kind of go on with, she just forgets basically, and forgets that she's forgetting, right? So the whole thing is just, you don't exist as long as my needs are met. My father more played this kind of game of he remembered, he didn't just forget, but would move the goalpost along, somewhat enjoying the torment, enjoying the begging, getting a sense of importance out of being kind of pursued and begged. Enjoying the power of being able to move the posts, etc. So I would say that, he played along with that learned helplessness. And again, if there was any direct aggression at Michael for the psychological abuse of, moving the basketball hoop as you're trying to take aim, he would hit or attack or withdraw. And the only way to avoid that was to be strung along and to play along with his desire to string along. And his enjoyment was the misery that this caused. So it's kind of a choice between confront the abuse and be punished, or secure some form of a relationship with Dad by being a willing torture victim of his enjoyment in my suffering. And this hurt. And, I don't have that much regard for my father for doing this. I don't have regard for what he did to my younger siblings. It really hurt a great deal to come second in so many ways. And this was something that couldn't be spoken about and so couldn't be shared as a grief. I attempted to talk with him before his death, but he was a regressed, traumatized child by that point, fearing death, fearing being mature himself. My assessment is that my mother was a narcissistic 17-year-old teenager with no competence in empathic love and a kind of reactive narcissistic focus on managing her needs and feelings and kind of batting through life and whatever, just kind of being lost in that and disappearing into fantasy wherever possible and just kind of getting the kids out of her way. She continued hitting me sporadically as one of her many kind of instinctual protocols to get what she wanted until I was 14, at which point I told her that although I could, of course, easily hit her much harder than she was hitting me, that I would match her energy for energy so that she understood what it felt like to be hit by her body weight. And so I would kind of gauge if she gave me a slap, let's say at 20 miles per hour or whatever, the speed of the slap and about the weight of the slap. So she'd react and do a slap. So I would give her a slap at about that same intensity in the same area. And she was, of course, as all narcissistic abusers are, outraged and furious that she would feel any of the helplessness that she inflicted on others, because now the real person, her, was being affected, rather than using the children as a dumping ground for her rage. She was actually having to be accountable for impact. And so, after trying to call the police, after complaining to Michael, she just stopped hitting me, which was the whole point, right? A sociopath and a narcissist will continue to abuse as long as it makes them feel good for even a few minutes, because it's all about them. And they will not stop unless you make it in their personal interest to stop, because you don't matter. And so she stopped hitting me after 2 or 3 mirrors back at her own body. And then she's like, well, I'm not, I'd like to hit you, but it's not going to feel good to me to feel what my hit feels like, so I'm not going to do it. I'll bully a younger child. Well, this is all in the middle of, the New Age euphoria where she's reading books on self-love and Louise Hay and all that. And there's just complete dissociation between any of that and what she's actually doing. In fact, I think she read a book on forgiveness and, whatever, that there was nothing to forgive because we're all God and perfect. I.e., I can keep bullying you, and that's God bullying you, the perfect me, just doing the right thing from the divine source. And this is why I empathize so much with the many children who have been abused by 5% of our priests, who, on the one hand and with one face, teach that homosexuality is a sin and all homosexuals will go to hell for all eternity because God loves us. And on the other hand, fuck 5 and 6 and 10-year-olds and tell them not to tell anyone. It's a sick game, and it's a game that is facilitated by all of us. When you mandate that you get thrown out of your group if you have sex, you can't have a partner, that's violating human freedom. No one should give up their right to sexual expression. When you take something healthy like that and fundamental and impose control based on stupidity and judgment, a lot of the delusion that sex is sinful comes from the delusion that the feminine energy that evokes so much wonder, so much desire, so much appreciation is sinful. It never was. The more you try and control healthy energy, and everyone has to allow it. People have to go along with this bullshit and say, oh yeah, we should be ashamed of our sexuality. No, nobody has to go along with that. Right? So, once you create a system like that of judgment, then in order to climb the hierarchy, you have to try and suppress your sexual energy. When you can't have an actual partner your own age, they're left alone with children. Well, it comes out, the healthy direct expression gets diverted or perverted into a less healthy expression. But then the greatest curse of all is shaming and blaming and confusing children, that somehow they will be punished for the sins of their priest. It's immense cruelty. My father also stopped violating my room when I said I would punch him if he came into my room without my permission, my one oasis. He came in, I gave him a quick punch, he called the police. I explained I have to hold this boundary. The boundlessness and invasion of the family system was too much to deal with for me. So there's an enormous loss of innocence and trust, understanding that the only reason your parents respect any boundaries, whether it's hitting you, humiliating you, or violating your space, is because they are narcissistically absorbed with their own fear of retaliation, and that otherwise they have no respect for themselves and other people. Being hit with the barrage of Christian nonsense about how to empathize with the parents, asking the little one to do more to the big ones than the big ones would do for the little ones, is just more insanity and fear. So, the biggest wound comes down to this. You have to have a stable thing in order to learn regulation. You cannot improve your tennis game if the net moves around randomly. It's meaningless. You've got to have a stable source. Parents are supposed to be that stable source to regulate feelings around, attachment feelings, the whole range of emotions. They're supposed to be stable. When they move around, it's a moving target. They drive a child insane, literally. So, needing a safer, stabler object, I switched a lot of my attention to things. I became more interested in things than people because they brought much more peace, because they didn't move around. They did the same thing. They didn't say, I want this, and then hit you if you were doing it. They stayed the same. So that's one big shift. The other big shift after sustained humiliation, primarily by my father in terms of direct verbal humiliation. My mother's humiliation was just your feelings and anything about you doesn't exist because you're not me. Right? So that's a tremendous sense of innate worthlessness. And then feelings are to be humiliated and made fun of. Was I shut down? And I don't have a gradient of attachment today. I don't have I can be a little bit interested in you, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. I have a desperate panic of the 2-year-old that could never find anything solid. And I have a dissociative distrust of you've crossed the line, you're not safe, you're too crazy, I want nothing to do with you. And those are my two positions for the attachment template. Extreme desperate need or dissociation. Now, almost nobody in a normal, healthy relationship fits black and white into those templates. So I have those two boxes, really, really close and strong, or goodbye. Almost no one fits into those two boxes, but I have to decide where to put each person. I don't have a bunch of other boxes in the middle. That is a tremendous residue in terms of how isolated I am, how frightened I am of being hurt and misunderstood because I am in a psychologically illiterate cult. There hasn't been a single person in my entire life that began the relationship saying, what's your attachment template? What boxes do you have available to put me in? And then let's work on those boxes together and I understand how that works. Instead, I have person after person after person who is ignorant of attachment theory and ignorant that they're ignorant, saying they want to be in a middle box that doesn't exist, and then getting mad when I put them in one or the other boxes that do exist. And nobody's taught me how to create other boxes. And many of the therapists have made things worse. Not one therapist has addressed this issue. There's a tremendous grief and all the hope and innocence and money and time poured into more than $150,000 of therapy, which largely led nowhere. I'm too tired to keep following the paths others put forward with promises based on ignorance and stupidity, because a therapist never gives a refund or an apology for their incompetence. They just take the money, take the time, don't apologize for the disappointment and the hurt, and pretend they wish me well, but they don't wish me well enough to learn their art or to hear how they're doing and make changes. So I feel angry about that. And most therapists don't want to hear how incompetent most therapists are. So and at what point does it become sick to pay one incompetent therapist to listen to the incompetence of other therapists and understand that they've got agendas that relate to them more than to me? Tremendous loneliness, insecure attachment, an inability to grieve, a clamp down on emotions, a deep sense of shame, unworthiness, and humiliation, an expectation of dying and being hit for standing up for my rights. These are daily physiological sensations and experiences, feeling 5 years old, feeling 3 years old, feeling invisible, because in a psychologically illiterate cult, nobody understands any of this. Nobody asks about any of this. And nobody makes the time for me to explain it. There's not been a single person in my entire life that showed up and said, I've got lots of time to really understand you. There hasn't been a single person that showed up that has asked, what's your traumatic template and where does it come from? And how can we work in a great friendship within that awareness? In fact, just about every intelligent avenue that is and has always been open has never been accessed by a single person on multiple continents. The Thai do the best job with intuitive empathy and presence and quality time. So I am happiest in Thailand. But it's not a verbal doorway. And with verbal intelligence being highly and overratedly elevated, and emotional vulnerability and depth of feeling being humiliated, suppressed, blocked, shamed, and ignored. There is a desert of emotional tutorage and intelligence in the people I've encountered. I feel exhausted because of managing all of this and realizing that I'm alone and I will be punished, as I always have been, for the symptoms of things induced by others. I feel tremendously insecure. I feel helpless in the many areas that I have received inadequate help. I wake up feeling absolute panic. I'm so terrified of being punished that in that anxiety, I do things that I then think are worthy of being punished, and I wait for being punished. And that waiting is so stressful that I can only do a couple of hours a day of that kind of thing and then want to escape. I don't want to venture out into the world. And yet I become more dissociative and unregulated, isolating in my cocoon. I do not know a single person on the planet who understands this, who prioritizes this, and who wants to love this pattern of energy that I identify with. I don't know how to respond to it a lot of the time. I know how to abuse myself. All I have to do is copy the template of my parents or my teachers, or in many cases, my friends and partners. I know how to gloss over and minimize feelings. I just don't know how to grieve. I know how to articulate. I just don't know how to cry. I know how to see what's going on in me. I do not know how to create a single human being in my world capable of loving me better than I love myself. I'm stuck here biologically, emotionally, mentally, in many ways. It seems like the most important thing the world can address is shifting these intergenerational abuse templates. I just cannot find anyone that wants to join me in making that the highest priority. Maybe 65, 68% of my entire energy has been spent managing this trauma, this fear, this terror, this grief, and a tremendous exuberance, tremendous vulnerability, tremendous creativity. So many ways to possibly connect. Tremendous trust has been hammered down into exhaustion, into cynicism, into bitterness, into rage, and into hate. And the cult has no constructive, transformative mechanisms for dealing with any of that either, let alone understanding its role in sustaining them. And so I claw through the day, step by step, noticing my many mistakes, my many pitfalls, my many inadequacies. In a cult that refuses to even acknowledge the map and the terrain that I'm in, let alone offer clear maps to transform and heal not me, but the cult that is giving these things to its people, to its children. I try to fit very, very small. I'm afraid of being big so that I can avoid being hit. And yet I believe that the world would be a better place for each person that responded to this message with quality time, with caring enough to become traumatically literate. Reading the body keeps the score. Learning somatic engagement. Focusing on our humanity, the grief that can melt the ice of this frozen emotion.